Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Tonight, you are listening to a calm retelling of The Shooting Party by Anton Chekhov, first published in 1884. It is a story about passion, jealousy, and guilt, and about how a single moment can irreversibly alter an entire life. I met him when he was already a man who had more behind him than ahead of him. He had been an investigating magistrate, had examined cases, prepared judgments, weighed guilt and doubted innocence. Now, he sat across from me with a tired smile and eyes that had seen too much. He spoke calmly, almost casually, as if he were recounting something that no longer concerned him. And yet, in every word there was something unresolved. He began to speak of a summer many years in the past. Back then, he had still been young, ambitious, convinced that life could be ordered like files on a shelf. He had accepted an invitation to spend a few days at a country estate where people hunted, celebrated, and surrendered to a sense of lightness. The countryside was beautiful. The forests wide, the evenings long. Nothing suggested that a crime would take its beginning there. Several people lived on the estate, but soon a young woman became the center of everyone's attention. She was married, yet scarcely more than a girl, beautiful in a way that was not loud, but effective. Her presence changed the atmosphere. Conversations grew tense, glances lingered longer, pauses became heavier. People still laughed, but beneath the laughter lay something unspoken. The magistrate, at that time still convinced of his control over himself, observed all this with professional distance. He saw the jealousy developing among the men, noticed the subtle tensions, the small gestures that revealed more than words. And yet, he believed himself uninvolved. He considered himself wiser, above such things. The hunt they organized seemed at first nothing more than a pretext. They went into the forest together, rifles over their shoulders, conversations filled with hints. But with each day, the atmosphere thickened. What had begun as a game took on more serious forms. Feelings intensified, claims of possession grew clearer, and admiration turned into desire. When the magistrate paused at this point in his story, he fell silent for a long time. Then he said softly that, at the time, he had not understood how closely passion and violence lie together. That a single glance, a wrong word, a moment of humiliation can be enough to cross a boundary. And as he continued speaking, it became clear to me. This was not a memory shared in order to be released. It was a confession that had come far too late. The magistrate went on, and with every sentence, that summer from long ago gained sharpness. The days on the estate passed outwardly in calm order. They breakfasted together, spoke of trivial matters, planned the next hunts. Yet beneath this order lay a tension no one openly named. Everyone knew that something had been set in motion, and everyone behaved as though it had nothing to do with them. The young woman stood at the center of this unspoken unrest. She moved lightly through the company, laughed often, spoke openly, and yet there was something provocative in her behavior, as if she were playing with the effect she produced. Her husband was usually absent, taciturn, a man who knew his role but showed little passion. It was precisely this indifference that seemed to attract the glances of the other men. The magistrate observed himself beginning to seek her proximity. Not openly, not decisively, but cautiously, almost by chance. He told himself it was mere interest, perhaps even pity, yet he felt his thoughts changing. He began to interpret situations, to remember gestures, to hear words twice. What he would once have regarded soberly suddenly gained weight. The other men were not untouched either. One of them, in particular, an acquaintance of the household, reacted sensitively to every attention the woman received. His friendliness was forced, his smile narrow. In conversations, he made remarks that sounded like jokes but carried the scent of possession. The magistrate noticed this, and for the first time felt something like rivalry. The hunts grew more intense. They ventured deeper into the forest, stayed away longer, returned later. Conversations circled ever more frequently around the same themes without naming them. The forest, the magistrate said, had a strange effect at that time. The vastness, the silence, the knowledge of the weapons, all this seemed to loosen inhibitions that were otherwise laboriously maintained in society. One evening, a quarrel broke out, seemingly insignificant, sparked by a remark, a misunderstood word. Voices grew louder, glances harder. The young woman remained silent, yet her silence acted like oil on fire. The magistrate remembered thinking at that moment that everything could still be calmed, that nothing serious had to happen. As he told me this, he lowered his gaze. He said that this very thought had been the most dangerous of all. For while everyone believed they retained control, the story had already begun to follow its own course. The next morning, a peculiar heaviness lay over the estate. No one spoke of the quarrel from the night before, yet it was clear that everyone carried it within them. Conversations were brief, glances avoided one another. The magistrate told how he tried to persuade himself that this tension was only a passing mood, an overheating of feelings such as easily arises in closed company. The young woman behaved more reservedly that day than usual. She spoke little, moved almost cautiously through the rooms as if she wished to avoid causing new unrest. Yet it was precisely this restraint that intensified her effect on the men. Each interpreted it differently. Each believed they recognized a message in her silence. The magistrate noticed how much his own perception had changed. He began to see things that perhaps had never been there. In the afternoon, they set out to hunt once more. The forest received them in silence, almost solemn. Light filtered softly through the trees. The air was cool, and the sounds of footsteps were muted on the soft ground. The magistrate recalled how this setting had given him a deceptive sense of calm at the time, as if everything out there were clearer, simpler, more elemental. The group split up. Each followed their own path, and the distances between them grew larger. The magistrate walked alone, the rifle over his shoulder, his thoughts restless. Again and again the image of the young woman appeared before him, bound to a feeling he did not wish to name. He told me that it was then he first grasped how dangerous it is to suppress emotions instead of acknowledging them. Suddenly he heard voices, muffled, hurried. He stopped, listened, but could not make out words. Then there was a crack, a hurried movement, as if someone were fleeing through the undergrowth. The magistrate felt a moment of uncertainty, but continued on his way. He did not wish to interfere, did not wish to be curious. Shortly afterward, a shot rang out. Not the clear, deliberate report of a hunt, but a sharp, irregular sound that tore through the forest. The magistrate stood frozen. He knew immediately that this shot had nothing to do with game. Something had happened that could not be taken back. When he finally rushed to the clearing where several of the others had gathered, the atmosphere had changed completely. Voices overlapped, faces were pale. In that moment, he said, he understood for the first time that the game had irrevocably turned serious. On the clearing, the young woman lay motionless in the grass. Her dress was dark with blood, her gaze empty, as if it had detached itself from the world. Around her stood the men, rigid, unable to comprehend what had happened. The forest, so recently still, seemed to hold its breath. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. The magistrate stepped closer. At that moment, his professional role returned to him, as if it had only been waiting to seize him. He knelt beside the lifeless body, examined the wound, inspected the ground, searched for traces. Yet, however hard he tried to remain objective, something inside him had broken. The woman who only hours earlier had spoken, laughed, and fallen silent, was dead. The question of the perpetrator hung unspoken in the air. The men looked at one another with suspicion, tense. Everyone knew that everyone could have had a motive. Jealousy, humiliation, fear. All of this had built up over the past days. The magistrate felt the others' glances briefly turn toward him. He too had been part of this web. He too had harbored feelings he had not admitted to himself. The body was brought back to the estate. The hunt was over. The atmosphere irreparably destroyed. Soon the authorities arrived. The magistrate, now officially acting in his function, led the first steps. He questioned those present, reconstructed sequences, noted statements. Yet the longer he worked, the clearer it became that the truth was difficult to grasp. Too many contradictions, too many unspoken things. The man who had reacted most vehemently earlier soon came under suspicion. His statements were restless, his explanations brittle. Yet others also appeared suspect, if only through silence or evasions. The magistrate recognized that this crime had not arisen from a single moment. It was the result of many small tensions that had condensed unnoticed. As he told me this, he said softly that this was the moment when he began to doubt his own impartiality. For how could he judge justly when he himself was part of the story? And how could truth come to light when everyone had something to conceal? The investigation dragged on. What had initially seemed clear grew blurrier with every statement. The magistrate told me how he filled files, retraced paths, compared times, and yet kept getting stuck at the same points. Each of those present had been somewhere in the forest at the time of the act. Each could have heard or seen something, and yet nothing could be conclusively established. Suspicion ultimately concentrated on the man whose jealousy had been most openly visible. His contradictions were too numerous, his explanations too hasty. He was arrested, led away, and to the outside world the case appeared resolved. But the magistrate knew that this solution was too smooth. He had seen too much, felt too much to believe in a simple truth. In quiet moments he began to question himself. He recalled conversations, glances, his own closeness to the young woman. He asked himself whether his role as investigator truly separated him from the story, or whether he had long since become part of it. This thought did not leave him. He felt a guilt that could not be captured in files. The trial proceeded correctly, almost routinely. Testimonies were read, circumstantial evidence presented, the verdict delivered. The accused denied the deed until the end, but his voice faded away. Society needed a culprit, and it had found one. The magistrate watched as the case was officially closed, while Within him remained an unrest that could not be soothed. After the verdict, he left the place. He never returned to the estate, avoided the region, the forest, the memories. Yet the story continued to accompany him. He told me that in the years that followed, he often thought back to those days, not out of nostalgia, but out of doubt. He asked himself whether justice had truly been done, or whether one had merely restored order. At this point in his account, he paused. His gaze became hard, almost absent, and I had the sense that what was decisive had not yet been said. After a long pause, the magistrate continued. He said that the story had never released its hold on him, even though it was officially closed. The years passed, his career developed further, yet again and again, his thoughts returned to that summer. Not because he mourned the young woman's death, but because he sensed that something unspoken had remained. He began to read old records once more. Witness statements, protocols, marginal notes. Things that had seemed insignificant at the time suddenly gained meaning. He recognized contradictions, small shifts, inaccuracies that ran through the case like cracks. And the more he read, the clearer it became to him that the convicted man had seemed guilty, but perhaps had not been the perpetrator. At the same time, memories returned that he had long suppressed. His own encounters with the young woman, words that had been spoken, glances that had lingered longer than they should have. He began to grasp that he himself had been more deeply entangled in the events than he had admitted at the time. Not through an act, but through omission, through looking away, through the desire to restore order instead of seeking truth. The magistrate told me that this realization gradually wore him down. He slept poorly, grew irritable, lost the certainty that had once distinguished him. In every new case, he saw traces of that old crime. He asked himself whether justice is possible at all when the one meant to establish it is not free of guilt. Finally, he made a decision. He began to write. Not for a court, not for the public, but for himself. He wrote the story as he now saw it, without embellishment, without consideration. He named names, described feelings, laid his own motives bare. This manuscript, he told me, was the only thing that had brought him a measure of peace. As he said this, I suddenly understood why he was telling me this story. It was not a memory. It was an attempt to assume responsibility, even if far too late. The magistrate fell silent after saying this, for a long time, as if he needed to test whether he had truly spoken everything that needed to be said. Then he explained to me that this manuscript had never been published. He had shown it to no one, no superior, no court. It was not a piece of evidence, but a testimony, not only about the act, but about himself. For the clearer the connections became to him, the more unbearable his own role appeared. He had seen how passion turned into possession, how jealousy grew, how the situation escalated, and yet he had done nothing. Not because he could do nothing, but because he did not want to. Because he believed himself above such matters. Because he was convinced his position protected him. The young woman had died, he said, because no one had assumed responsibility in time. Not only the one who fired the shot bore guilt, but also those who remained silent, who looked away out of convenience, fear, or self-deception. He himself belonged among them. This realization, he said, had been heavier than any judicial defeat. Was the convicted man innocent? I finally asked. The magistrate did not answer immediately. Then he said that he no longer wished to answer this question, not because it was unimportant, but because it came too late. Justice, he said, has its moment. If that moment is missed, only order remains, and order is not the same. When he left the manuscript behind, not with the request that it be published, but with the hope that at least one person would think the story through to the end, not as a criminal case, but as a warning against underestimating emotions, against delegating responsibility, against believing oneself uninvolved. And as I read these pages, I understood that this drama had not begun on the hunt. It had only found its end there. And with that, today's story comes to an end. Perhaps you are now wondering, why do the conflicts, the jealousy, and the decisive quarrel remain so vague in this story? Why does Anton Chekhov merely suggest so much instead of stating it openly? And what does this narrative restraint reveal about how guilt, responsibility, and repression operate in this story? We explore these and other questions in our accompanying book, Golden Pages, Volume 3. There, you will also find the story again to read, place it in its literary context, and show why Chekhov wrote one of his sharpest texts on responsibility with this novella. You will find the link in the description. And if you like, we will listen to each other again tomorrow on Sleepy Classic Tales. Good night.